It's a joy to be with you again this evening. The group changes each night. I like that. I've tried to make them stand alone a little bit so you can get something from each one if you haven't been to the others. But I want to take us back a little bit and just think about the route we've taken. So this is the fourth session, and we need to start moving them out of their places in Europe, or else we'll never get to the end. We have my hope is to tonight talk about the immigration into the New World, and then next Wednesday evening return to the European Mennonite Church and look at the impacting things that have happened to them since the 1700s, particularly World War II, and also the Russian migration, and then wrap it up all the last night with saying, how do we move forward into the brave new world of the 21st century as Anabaptists today? So that's our vision goal. But I just want to kind of capture a bit of what we did. Here is the map of Europe. Here is the English Channel. Obviously, I'm not a cartographer. This is the English Channel. So Zurich is down here. The Rhine flows north, like that. The largest pocket of Anabaptists are in the southern part and in the Netherlands. Now, we talked about how they moved into Munster and the debacle at Munster, but the largest pockets that impact the world in the 1700s are in this area. The Black Forest is right here and along the Rhine. One of the things that happens is there is a 30 Years' War in Europe from 1618 to 1648, where Europe is fought, the Catholic and Protestant forces fight for control of Europe, and it ends with the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia gives the nobility of each region the right to choose which one they'll be. So it's the first time that the Catholics give credence to the Protestant movement. There's been an uneasy alliance over portions of most of that time, but the war kind of solves that problem. And what happens in the 30 Years' War, particularly in this area, the Rhine River, what happens in this region, let me go to a map of that. Right, this is the Palatinate, this is the Rhine flowing north, this is the French border today, this is Swiss cantons are down here. This area is ravaged. There are portions of land here where land changes hand 80 times between the two armies in 30 years' time. And they fight a scorched earth policy, they have a scorched earth policy, the armies, because they feed their armies on foot. In other words, the armies live off the land. And so as war rages across this area, this is absolutely devastating area. There are entire villages that disappear. It becomes a well-settled, fertile land into almost a wasteland as the armies fought. Interestingly enough, this is also the site of the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes are right here. And so this is a much contested piece of ground. And the feudal lords of the region needed good farmers. And it's about the same time that in Zurich, the canton of Zurich, and in Bern, and other places, they decide they want to get rid of the Anabaptists. And so they have more edicts. Now, they essentially banish them from the canton. The last death, the last capital crime is in, I think, 1614 in Zurich with Hans Landis. But they're pushed out of their homelands. Now, these are people with last names like Hummel, Müller, Dreyer, Yellow, Yoder. These are people who later impact the Holmes County Amish community, or the Holmes County community, and Burl Mennonite. And one of the things that I am interested in is moving us into our world. And so they're pushed out. And at the same time, the lords of these regions need farmers. So they invite these good Swiss farmers into their lands to reclaim the land. Now, Swiss farmers are good at two things. They're good. They've discovered how to burn down limestone and make lime dust, and use rye and lime on their fields. And they also know how to haul manure. Did I tell you this? Manure in portions of Europe is seen as a waste, and so they burn it in some cases. But because they're pushed up into the mountain highlands of Swiss, they learn how to farm non-optimal lands, and they know how to use manure. So they move north into this land that's been ravished by the war, and they're able to reclaim the soil and really bring back its fertility. Now, when they move north, they make two commitments. One of them is they will not build church buildings. So they meet for worship in their homes or barns. The second thing is they will not proselytize. So they become quieter. Now, there are also other people living in this region. And they follow much of the European model farming where the farmers live in villages and farm the land outside of the village. And so as this is happening, they are able to bring back this land. Now, they also have to pay a special tax because they're Anabaptist. And when this is happening, and they grow progressively more integrated into their world, the neighbors who aren't Anabaptist look on them with some fear. They're going to take over our land. They're going to take over our place. And they begin to complain to the feudal lords. And this is a cycle that repeats itself about every 25 years in this region, where they'll settle in a place and they'll be given fairly much freedom, and the land will develop, and then somebody complains. And so the neighbors, mostly Protestant neighbors, complain that they have an unfair advantage because they don't have to pay tithe. They forget about the special tax. Convenient to forget about those things. And so they now in the Protestant world and the Catholic world, if you didn't show up for church regularly, the priest or the preacher came to your house and he fined you. I think it would work great for people to go to Sarasota, but I think I told you that, didn't I? We could build new church buildings and all kinds of things. But so it begins this cycle. They're never permitted to own land. And it begins this cycle. And there's always a certain amount of fear that's produced in this. It's in this world that this young preacher, a young Swiss preacher, begins to, he moved north, and he moved into these areas, Saint Maria Mines, right in this area near Strasbourg, France, and he begins to preach some new ideas. By now, the South German and the Swiss Anabaptist churches, this is in the late 1600s, are only having communion once a year. And it is common for nursing or expecting mothers to not go to church. And so some of the women hadn't had communion for 10 years. And also, they don't practice feet washing. I told you some of this, didn't I? I forget where I said what. Anyway, but it develops, and like is often the case, this young preacher ruffles feathers. And the group divides. He's also interested in practicing the ban a little more. Did I tell you this? His followers? Okay. So I should. So actually, he calls a preacher's meeting. He has no right to do it, but he calls a preacher's meeting, and there's 60 plus preachers who live in this, Anabaptist preachers who live in this area, and the most senior bishop, a man named Hans Ries, does not show up at the meeting. So they send a girl to fetch him, and he says, "I'm not coming, I have hay down." And it ticks the young preacher off, and he said, "Who's on the side of Hans?" And 26 men get up, and he excommunicates them and Hans right on the spot. That's not a good practice, okay? Especially from a younger preacher. Hans Ries, he had experienced persecution, but one of the issues here is this group of young preachers, and predominantly young, are interested in bringing some revival back into the church. For purity, one of the things that they're wrestling with is what they call the Halbglaube, half-baptizers. These people who are interested, very sympathetic to the Anabaptist cause, but not willing to go all the way. And they would they were not willing to rescind their membership at the state churches because they had to pay the fine. So Hans had people like that in his church, and this young preacher named Jacob said, no, we shouldn't have that. They need to make a final decision. And it's over the span of 5 to 7 years, this thing escalates, and by 1700, there's a clear schism. And the group that follows the new young preacher, his last name is Almond, so they call the people Almonds Light, or Almanish, or Amish. And that schism never fully. Now, this is not the only schism that happens. Our movement, like all movements, and because we don't have a hierarchy, we don't have a pope or a Luther or something like that, the movement takes a lot of different flavors. And it's easy for us to look back and want it to look like Berlin Mennonite, or actually better yet, Providence, where I go to church. That's how they all looked. And no, you know what, they didn't. They were different. And Anabaptism has flavors, different flavors. But the group that follows Almond predominantly lives in this area and some of the Swiss Highlands. And so, and again, it's easy for us to look back, and particularly us as Mennonites to look back and say, oh, Jacob Almond was wrong. Actually, you practice much of what Jacob Almond taught here at Berlin, or in all of our churches. Was he rash in how he handled it? Yeah. But he later felt really bad about that, so he excommunicated himself. The only problem is when whoever excommunicates you has to put you back in, so then he had to put himself back in, and it only lasted a couple of weeks. Again, and Arish is as much at fault in this kind of personality clash as Almond. So rather than assigning blame, let's look back and say, this is what happened. And say, did it affect our movement? Yeah, it did. And there's this uneasy connection between the two groups. By now, the groups, especially from here north, are known as Mennonites or Mennonists. And so these people very quickly become known as Almanish, and they live in neighborhoods. They worship the same way. They continue to worship the same way. You couldn't tell the difference in that world until until the American experience, at least. So they didn't look different. They practiced a little more restrictiveness in church policy. They practiced feet washing. And they practiced communion twice a year. How often do you have communion here? Twice a year? 4 to 6 times a year. We have it 4 times a year. A lot of our churches have it 2 to 4 times a year. And that's the model that we built it on. So, but it's in this world that immigration to the Western world happens. And I want to shift back, and I want to tell you just a bit of a personal story. So in my own academic experience, I've been shaped by some really good professors. I've had some really bad professors too. By the way, they're at Ohio State, the bad ones, and they're at Yale too. There was a class at Yale. I think I slept during most of it, but when we went to Yale for our master's work, and this is relatively recent, 2013 to 15. We went to study under Bruce Gordon, who's a leading Swiss Reformation historian. But one of the gifts he gave me is told me to study what you really enjoy. And I wanted to study the Reformation, understand, but I was particularly interested in understanding what is it in people that makes them move halfway across the world and move. And so in one of the classes I was in, we were supposed to write a narrative history. This professor was really good too, because he said, most academic histories you read are so terrifically boring that you should never waste your time reading them. You may need to read in the book, but don't read it. He said, number one, if you'll fall asleep, it'll hit you in the face and knock you out. He said, so write with some story and engagement. He said, don't forget, this is a gift he gave me, don't forget that history happens to people like you and me. Now, before we went to Yale, I grew up in this world. Now, we hadn't lived here for about 20 years, but I grew up 4 miles from here, where I was born. The home farm is there. This is a watercolor painting of my dad's home farm. I was born on this farm. Deep connection to this farm. I'm the oldest of I think, 75 grandchildren on that side. And I was really close to my grandmother. Now, before we went to Yale, I went to see my grandmother, and I told her, Grandma, Narita and I are going to graduate school. And Grandma said, what's that? By the way, I once took an Ohio State professor to visit my grandmother. He told me he wanted to see real Amish. And so I'll take you to see some real Amish. And we met in Millersburg at the Walmart. And he said, should I drive? And I said, yes. He's driving a blue Miata convertible. And I wanted to ride it. And so we drove through Berlin, I'm waving at everybody in the blue Miata convertible. Because, so we drive in and go in a long lane. And when you went into my grandma's house, you went in, and she lives in the Doughty house, this piece right here. The mother-in-law suite that's attached. Now, they attached that for her parents. And her grandma, my great-grandmother, her mother died. Mother and father both died in this house. And at the time we went, my grandma was almost 90. And so I took Dr. Shields, and we go around the back, and you knock on the door, and then you simply open the door and you say, Mommy! And she always knew who it was. She couldn't see, oh, Marcus, it's you. I had no clue. She had an extra, she raised 12 children. So she had extrasensory perceptions that you and I don't, probably. But anyway, so I took Dr. Shields in, and he asked her, so what were you doing today? Oh, and she said, I was just sitting here reading the budget. Then I had to explain to him what the budget was. I think he thought she was reading a financial paper of some form. And she said, let me put coffee on. And my grandma was at the best with this kind of thing. So she had a lifetime coffee maker, and so you put it on the stove, and then the water burbles up. You hear that sound, and that smell invades this little space. And it was just one of those moments. And then while we were there, her great-granddaughter came running over and said, Gross, Mommy, can I sit on your lap? And when we drove out the driveway, and she visited, she was really good with him. By the way, one thing she told him, she said she's lived all her life on this farm, one end or the other. She lived a few years at the other end of the farm in another house, but this is where she was born. She was born in the house, and this is her home. She's deeply rooted and connected to this place. He said, so when you go to church, have you always gone with the same people? Yeah, she said they have. We asked her that day, when did you start sitting with the young people? And she said, when she was 10. And so they sit by age. She sat beside the same lady for 81 years. Every other Sunday, and they didn't even really like each other. They fought. Okay, they're neighbors. Because we're humans. But when we drove out the driveway, Dr. Shields reached over. He's not an effusive man. He punched me on the shoulder and said, you set me up. I said, I don't understand. He said, no one lives like that. And I said, yeah, that's how my grandma has lived. And he got all teary-eyed. And he said, you know what a gift you have? To live in a world like this. He said, you know how much of the world, how many people out there want what you have? And sometimes it takes people from outside to tell us. Now again, that doesn't mean that happens just because we have the right last name. This is something that's built in our world view as Amish and Mennonites. The value of our faith, our deep faith, our families, our community, those kinds of things. Anyway, so I told Grandma what we're going to do, and I think both Grandma and I realized when we left in August of 2013 that we may not see each other again. And we went to school, and the first semester I was in this history class, the professor gave us the license to write well. And he said, I want you to pick a transitional person in your history, and write about them. And I was particularly interested in why people move across an ocean and start a new life. And so I found this little Amish girl. There's so few immigration records. I found this little Amish girl who was born in the Palatinate. Her family had come from Switzerland and moved north. And I'm in the middle of working on this project when my father calls. And tells me that my grandma had took it. She just gave up. And she doesn't have much time to live. And a lot of things, like why did I leave? By the way, my grandma never understood my academic pursuits, but she supported them. When I graduated from Ohio State in 2010, I got a card from her that said, "Congratulations, best wishes, Grandma," with a $20 bill in it. I did not want to spend that $20 bill because it meant she supported me. Anyway, in the middle of this, my father calls, and I thought a lot about this, and sure enough, 3 nights later, the phone rings at 2 a.m. And you know instantly what it is. It was my dad. And he said, "Grandma died. She died in the room with her 12 children by her side." And I thought of Dr. Shields' words, and I thought, where does this come from? Why do we think like this? And so I was in the middle of this project, so I'm going to divert now and talk about the project. So the Amish and Mennonite families who live in this area, in the late 1600s, William Penn sends land agents to go up and down the Rhine River, and they're looking for farmers in Pennsylvania, this strange place across the ocean, Penn's Woods. He needs good German farmers, and so there are no large groups that immigrate. There's no Mayflower for Amish or Mennonites. They go in scattered, smaller family groups, joining the regular or the more generic Germanic migrations west into the New World. And the first Mennonites actually immigrate to Philadelphia, the suburb of Philadelphia, where the first church was. Germantown, thank you. They come from an area about right here. The Rittenhouse family moves in the 1690s already, 1680s and 90s. They developed the first paper mill in the United States. Is done by a Mennonite family in Germantown, and later Scott Paper Company bought this, and they make toilet paper there. I read a New Yorker article how the Mennonites were instrumental in the development of toilet paper. I love it. I love finding those things. But so they immigrated. Our people, the people who set the base for Holmes County, Berlin Mennonite, the Holmes County Amish community, don't immigrate until a little later. So in the 1720s and 30s, there's a renewed kind of push from the Penns. They need farmers. So the land agents work their way down and find these German farmers. And I found this little girl who was born in a little village. On kind of in this part of the Platte. And she was when she was 6 years old, her father comes in one day and he says, "We're going to America." What do you think goes through a 6-year-old's brain when her dad comes in and says, "We're going to move to America"? "Dad, where's America?" It's all been done in Pennsylvania Dutch, hillbilly Dutch. Because that's what, when I preach over there, they say, "You preach in hillbilly Dutch." But the language would have been understandable to anyone who speaks Pennsylvania Dutch today. Their foods, they ate Swiss cheese, and ribbel soup, and cold soup, bean soup. I told you what Otto Showalter has for lunch on Sundays, don't I? In Deichhoff, this little village where we were at, in 2004 we were there and I preached in their church. That's when all the people laughed and said, "You're preaching in hillbilly Dutch." And we went to Otto's place after church for lunch, and Otto and his wife were there, and they and I poked Narita and said, "Look at the table. There's bread and Swiss cheese and cold cuts and all kinds of spreads and pickles and beets." Does anyone know where that is normally eaten in Holmes County? How many of you know? It's Amish church lunch. Sure it is. So I asked Otto, I didn't want to be too bold, but I said, "Otto, you eat this every Sunday lunch?" And Otto's kind of gruff. He said, "Oh, eat it every day. It's called a farmer's lunch." And so we bring our culture with us. Being Amish and Mennonite in this world is as much, there are cultural pieces to this. Anyway, but this is a picture of the Platte. This is from the Königsberg Castle. There are the Amish and Mennonites, the people with last names like Hostetler, Miller, Yoder, Troyer, Mast, Hirschberger, and all the Slabaugh and all those Amish Mennonite names would have farmed these valleys here. And so these little villages. But they would have moved from the Swiss Highlands. This is from the Emmental. These are typical Swiss houses that they would have lived in. Some of these have been in Anabaptist hands. This is near the Funkhauser farm. by the way, the phone calls are Bruce and Ann and their family, and Narita and I were there in 2017. And what is her first name? After a while, it'll come to me. But it's a phone call to the family, and this lady of the household talks about her own journey. And this farm is called the Teufelversteck, baptizer hiding place. In the barn, there's a trapdoor. If you run across the trapdoor, it releases, and you get down into this little space between the two floors of the barn where you can hide. The Anabaptists hid there. And they discovered this in their barn, and she begins to do research, and she begins to read the scriptures through that, and is herself baptized as an adult. This is people we met. And so this is very close there. This is a very typical Swiss. The Magdalena, this little girl, would have been they would have lived in houses similar to this. This is the house part, this is the barn. It helps heat both of these when you do them together. But she would have grown there. Think about what this little 6-year-old girl might have felt. Oh, she's all excited. We're going to go to America. But then she begins to notice that whenever they talk about going to America, Grandma and Grandpa get really quiet. And she realizes that as they get closer to the spring of 1737, when they're going to leave, that Grandma and Grandma are not going on this trip. Think about the pain, sorrow, and the joy and hopefulness. How they're so closely connected. And her grandma would have cried as they get closer. There's these accounts of immigration in the early 1700s as families begin to move to particularly America, where people, Germans think that singing is good for a troubled soul. And there are villages where, not just Mennonite and Amish villages, but other villages where the entire villages will sing until they finally can tear themselves apart. In one case I read, they sang from 7 o'clock in the morning until 2 o'clock in the afternoon until they could kind of get torn apart. So think about, as you think about leaving the homeland, leaving what you've always known, leaving everything you have, and moving to America. When I do this for elementary school children, I ask them, what do you think they took along? Because, for instance, the Lehman family, which is this little girl, her last name is Lehman, her first name is Magdalena. And I love this, Narita is no longer here, but she sometimes says, I think you like her better than you like me. She's dead, so it's easier, but anyway, sometimes, and you know how I mean that. But, so she would have experienced all these emotions. Now, this is one of the larger groups that leaves. There's actually 11 families that are traveling together in the spring of 1737. We have so few immigration records that it's hard to piece together how this journey might have looked as they move. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the political issues that surround this, because I think sometimes when we do that, we dehumanize history. This is people. Yes.
We have someone here tonight who has left her
Oh,
country too, Olena.
where's Olena?
Right back
Yeah.
here.
And you left the Ukraine? No. Yeah. And so you can really identify with this feeling of hopefulness for the future and pain of leaving.
And they left family behind.
Yeah.
Mothers and kids.
Yeah. Can you imagine? Like we are so we have a really good life, surrounded by our families and our world. So as they're moving north, there's these 11 families that are traveling together. There's Millers, there's Masts on it. There's a young Amish bishop named Hans Jacob Kaufman who keeps a record. And it's they found it in a family Bible in the 1980s, this little diary of the journey. And it's so poignant as I read this. And so they left their homes here in the Palatinate and took riverboats north, rafts north on the Rhine. Now, they could only take what they could carry. One trunk. The Lehmans, the one family I've studied more extensively because of the records, took one trunk. We know they took one trunk. And what do you take for the rest of your life? I love when asking children this, they say clothing. Well, most Europeans like that had 2 sets of clothing at the most, so you just wore them. But we know they took Bibles. We know they took their songbooks. They're at Behold, if you want to come look at them. We know they took seedlings. They took grape cuttings. They took seedlings, apple seedlings. They took seeds. They took a little bit of farming things. They're anticipating a world. And there's a push and a pull that moves them out of this area. The push is the fact that they can't own land. And the question isn't so much about land ownership, it's the future for our families. Will we be tenant farmers and transients for the rest of our lives? What will our family have? What can we leave behind for our family? And then there is still some, at least not overt persecution, but there is a pressure against Anabaptism. Extra taxes. Many of them sneak out because you have to pay an exit tax and you don't have the money to pay. Many of them move north. They have enough money to get to Amsterdam or Rotterdam, where they depend on the good fortunes of the Dutch Mennonites. And the Dutch Mennonites write these letters back saying, don't send any more people, we're running out of money. Because then they fund their way to America. They pay ship's fare for most of these people. I love doing this with children, but what do you take for the rest of your life? And then you have to take all your own food for the ship's. There's no cafeteria on a ship at this point. And this is pictures from the Rhine on the journey north. This was on our riverboat cruise south, where everything. But think about what Magdalena and her family and these other families might have felt as they passed these schlosses, castles, where her people have been imprisoned. And I often think about the things that we kind of see as majestic and grand are actually signs of oppression and pain. Because she remembers her people. This is one of my favorite places in the world. This is a cathedral at Cologne, Germany, Cologne. And the South Tower is 593 steps to the top. But this, as they passed by, she would have remembered the stories she heard the preacher say, her father talked about from the Martyr's Mirror. Because we know they use those stories and the Osborne as they're moving. Now they get closer to Rotterdam, and one of the things that you find out about migration is the overwhelming smells that are associated. They write about the smells. These are country folk who know what manure smells like, but they don't know what cities smell like. And so one of the common sayings was, that schmeckt wie eine Stadt. That smells like a city, because everyone dumped their sewer into the streets. And Rotterdam is a harbor city, so it smells like dead fish and tar and sewer. And think about Magdalena. She says, Dad, how big are we soon going to be there? Yeah, we will. And are we going on a ship? Yeah, they're going on a ship. And they would have gone on a ship very similar in size to this. It's a 2-masted sailing ship called the Charming Nancy. There's not much charming about it. The captain, the Stedman family captains these ships. They're known for packing the ships because they get paid for every live body that they land in Philadelphia. In the case of the 1737 journey, the spring 1737, they took one trip, always left in the spring, and came back and with the fall winds empty. But he had about 400 people in a ship that's 155 feet long and about 60 feet wide. There is, this is the ship's holds, not the exact ship, but some of these places they had bunks in it. The bunks are 18 inches wide, about 5 feet long, and about 18 inches of space between the bunks. There's about 6 high in the holds. There's bunks for about 180 people with 400 people on ship. Think about, and here is the thing. It's easy for us to think they didn't know they knew the risk. So what I've discovered about these sailing ships is almost none of the time did they sail upright like we envision a sailing ship. Good sailing captains could lay those ships nearly on their side because that's when you had the least amount of wind resistance. What happens in the holds of the ship to the people down there? And you have to take all your own food. It's the second morning out. They leave Rotterdam. This is Rotterdam, and every ship going to the American colonies at that time had to stop on English soil. So they sail out of Rotterdam and go to the English Channel. It takes them 9 days to get to the England from July 29th to that should say June 29th. It's hard to go backwards. I don't do math very well. But the second morning out, Magdalena would have come up on the deck of the ship, and she would have noticed a small group of Amish families standing at the rail of the ship. And like little kids do, she would have kind of looked down between the legs, and she would have noticed the bishop, Hans Jacob Kaufmann, reach into his jacket pocket, and she would have realized with some horror, as she got a little closer to what was happening, as she watched one of those young Amish families kneeling there, and the body of their child, they're sewing into a piece of canvas. They're putting stones in it. Then Hans Jacob Kaufmann reaches into his jacket pocket and says these words. Now you have to kind of know where these fit, and I'll tell you. He would have said something very similar to Gute Nacht, der meine Leben, Gute Nacht, der meine Herzensfreund. And then that small group of Amish would have sang that line. The one place the Amish still do that, using this hymn and tune, is at the graveside of everyone who died. And Magdalena would have watched as that young Amish family drops the body of their playmates into the hungry mouth of the ocean. Now this is a story that repeats itself repeatedly on this journey. And that's when I read Hans Jacob Kaufmann's small diary, I nearly always want to cry. Because he had 26 funerals for those 11 Amish families on the journey to America. 24 of them were for children. And the families knew the risk. The average life expectancy of a child to survive, not just Amish, or any children to survive the North Atlantic journey in this time period, children 7 years old and younger, 50% of them died in the journey to America. Babies, 1 year old and younger, 90% of them died in the journey to America. And yet, it is overwhelmingly young families who decide to make the move. The older people are established, they're going to live their life there. It's the young families who pick everything up and move, never to see their parents and extended family again. Hans Jacob Kaufmann records that they land at Cowes, England, near Plymouth, and he said, "Today I buried 2 of my own children on English soil, never to see them again." They leave, and think about how this would have shaped your life. The journey took a long time. They left England on July 13th, and they finally landed Philadelphia on October 18th. That's August, September, that's 3 months, a little over 3 months there at sea. In all that time, they saw one other ship. How do you know the captain's going the right way? And the interesting thing is, it's not storms that he writes about the most. It's when the wind stops and the ships be calmed. When the ship doesn't move, that's when people start dying. And it's poor eating and everything. And now, Magdalena would have been on the ship. The Lamans are the only family of the 11 Amish families who were on the ship who didn't lose a child. And when I found these records, I just sat back and said, what makes people do that? Is the risk outweigh the reward? By the way, that is a really Western way of thinking. It is not a way of thinking of these people. These people are interested in, they're thinking, they're not interested in legacy building. They're interested in providing something for their families where they can live well and worship God well. That's what they're interested in, and they see America as a place where that can happen. They have heard about land ownership. They've heard that when you go to America in Pennsylvania, this strange place across the ocean, you can own your own farm. They sailed into the Delaware Bay and up the Delaware River. What do you think goes through a little girl's mind when they finally land at the city of brotherly love and she gets off the ship and it doesn't move anymore? I'm sure she said, Dad, look, it doesn't rock anymore. Little girls all do that, you know. By the way, I also know what her grandma said when her father's name was Benedict. When Benny came into the house that day and said, "I think we're going to go to America." You know what his mother said? They lived with his parents in Europe. She said, "Now why would you want to do that?" That's because when I went to my grandma and said, "We're going to go move to Connecticut," she said, "Now why would you want to do that?" That's just what grandmas say. And so these are humans. They're people like you with grandchildren your age and children your age. And so don't dehumanize history by making it statistics. There's human emotion in this. And so they land in Philadelphia. We don't know who met them. We know they move about 60 miles northwest of there and settle in Berks County, Pennsylvania. And think about the feelings that Benedict Lehman might have had a few weeks later as he takes his family out. And for the first time in generations, he said, "This is our land. We can own this land." And there, they raised their family. The Lehmans raised their family. When she's 18, Magdalena one night hears corn being thrown up against her window, and she looks out the window and John Miller's out there. I don't know. But she married John Miller. Maybe she went to an apple schnitzing and looked up and looked in his eyes, and they got married. Who knows? But think about how might it have happened. She married John Miller, and they lived in Berks County, Pennsylvania. And in the 1750s, something happens that really shapes their lives. There is a great global war going on. They think they're away from the war, but a group of French raiders moved their way south. They're Native Americans along, but it's led by the French. Moved south, and one of the Amish families is in the way. And they attacked the cabin. And they fired the cabin. You know the story, the Hostel cabin. John and Magdalena lived not very far from the Hostel. And the next morning, John had went up. By now, Magdalena is a 27-year-old Amish housewife with 4 children. John went out that morning to chop wood, and it's recorded that he went up with his axe handle like this, and this group of the raiding party was just it's just daylight, and they took one shot at him and hit his hand, and the bullet deflected off the axe handle. He records that the axe handle was chest high, and the bullet deflected, crippled his hand, and he became known as Crippled John or Indian John, because they thought it was a group of Native Americans. They were included in it. But what do you think Magdalena did that morning? We don't know, but we know that probably that afternoon she stood at the gravesite of her neighbor's wife, another Amish lady she went to church with, and she heard those words, "Goeie Nacht, er meine Leben, goeie Nacht, er meine Hartzenfeld," which means good night, those I love, good night to those who my heart really cares for. That's the interpretation. It's a hymn from the Osborne. In the 1760s, late 1760s, they're living in Berks County. They hear more about war, and both sides want her boys. By now, they have 11 children. The Continental Congress wants her boys, and the British want her boys. So they decide to move. Now think about that. They're moving for conscience sake. They move on west to Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and John dies there in 1798. And she would have stood at the gravesite again and heard those words. And it's there a few weeks later. By the way, this is how many of their cabins first looked. In 1798, when John died, this is their plot of land in Somerset County. It's actually not very far from Laurelville. The camp at Laurelville is south of there. This is actually more like their house. So in 1798, it's now the United States of America did their first survey, and it records the widow Miller living in a house in a cabin 18 by 22 with her oldest grandson and his wife living with her. She raised her family in a cabin 18 by 22. The barn is 22 by 44. The priorities are right? Anyway, That's very typical. It's easy for us to romanticize this life back then, but they lived in places like this. Many of the times, the boys slept in the barn. That was just normal practice. And it's here in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, when our oldest son comes to her in the early 1800s, 1809, and says, "Grandma, I think we're going to move on west." And you know what Grandma said, "Why would you want to do that?" Yeah? But her oldest son is now an Amish bishop, and they move on west, and they had gone on a scouting party and discovered the land in the Ohio Valley, and they go north to Pittsburgh, follow the big Sandy Creek to Fort Lawrence, Bolivar, and follow the Tuscarawas River south to the first ferry crossing south. And the first ferry crossing is at New Philadelphia, where the Moravians are. And they cross the ferry, and the first valley is already fairly settled. So they move into the second valley, which is the valley of the Sugar Creek. And they settle there. Their nephew is along, and he moves on west and settles in the valley of the Walnut Creek. And so we think this is a picture of one of the first houses in Holmes County. Boy, we live well, don't we? Okay? And I tell you this story. This is a typical immigration story. This is how our Amish and Mennonite people come to America. They don't come now later, there are larger groups who come. But the ones who impact Ohio, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, and those places, the ones who impact Berlin, Mennonite, come in this wave of immigration. Immigration essentially stops in the 1760s when the colonies halt immigration. So this is how we come to America. By the way, so all of this is happening. I do my research, and in the middle of this, my grandma died. And we come home, drive in our little red Honda Fit. Found out at 2 a.m. At 6 a.m., got up, threw a few things into a box and a bag, and came back. And by that night, I'm sitting in a steamy shop 4 miles from here. And my dad and his siblings are sitting there. Because I'm the oldest grandchild, I sit next. And these people are coming through the line, and I feel surrounded by home. And one of our old family friends comes through, whose mother is the same age as my grandmother. He's a generation older than I. So I asked him about his mother. She's 91 at the time. Oh, he said, she's still good. She could mow her own yard and everything. But he said, you can't visit with her anymore. Oh, okay. I thought maybe she's hard of hearing. He said, no, she has dementia. She's lost her ability to remember. You can't visit with her anymore. And the historian in me sat there and thought, lost your memory. When you lose your memory, you don't have the ability to interact in today's world. When a group of people loses their collective memory, we lose our ability to be affected in today's world. When Berlin, Mennonite, loses its collective memory of who they are, doesn't mean it isn't flavored by all the people who come and make us who we are. But when we lose our collective memory of who we're connected to, we lose our ability to be as effective in today's world. 2 days later, I stood on the hillside on our family home farm, and the bishop reaches into his jacket pocket, pulls the eyes going down, and says, "Gute Nacht, meine Leben. Gute Nacht, meine Herzensfreund." And suddenly I'm connected to this group of people. And it feels like home. I suddenly understood what Dr. Shields meant when he reached over and punched me on the shoulder and said, "You know what you have." And again, this is not about being a genetic Mennonite with the last names like Yoder and Miller. That's not the point. The point is, you at Berlin, you belong to a community. First of all, Berlin, but radiating out from here, that has a long history. And when we forget that history, we either, I'll talk about the last night, when we forget the history and kind of assimilate into post-modernity, the time we live in, we have no effective prophetic voice anymore to speak to the ills of this world, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to shelter the destitute. And I also believe that if we're not careful, if we focus too much on that and worship that, we become like Munster and Burkholz. So finding that balance as we move forward in our world is important. But if you don't know who you are, you have no voice. So, this is my home place. I have this love-hate relationship with Holmes County. These people are some of the best people I know, but they also mind their business a great deal. I told you a story about when we moved home in the orange pickup. Yeah. I sometimes feel just hemmed in. But in that hemmed in feeling, there's also something good. Now, it's also healthy for us to open up our hearts to the world around us and invite them into this place. Invite them into this sense of home that we enjoy. So, when you think about the Amish and Mennonite in this community, and in most of our, I was trying to think of how to categorize it. The Goshen, EMU, Heston world. This is how we came to America. Generally. Now, the Swiss movement that comes through Wayne County comes later, but there again, they have their own story, but it's very similar to ours. Now, I'm open to questions. By the way, this is history. That whole bit about dates and names, that isn't really history, that's statistics. History is populated by humans like you and I, with feelings like you and I. Grandmas who say, why would you want to do that? Little girls who cry when their playmates die. That's what history is. Questions?
Just a comment.
Yes.
Really, Marcus, really appreciate your talk about movement and about home and about also inviting others into home. I think about my own family history, and you can trace the Hostettler, this lineage down to that massacre, and on the other side, folks who were welcomed in and joined kind of along the way. We're Reformed and we're Lutheran and other things like that. And
I think we need to move away from thinking about Anabaptist by last name.
Mm-hmm.
And think about the spiritual heritage, which is what I'm getting at. The sense of home that you feel at places like Berlin or Providence is something that is deeply spiritual and much more than genetic.
Well, and maybe you'll get to this, but so often in Anabaptism there needs to be chances for renewal.
Yeah.
And Jacob Bauman's young preacher, we could talk about the Hutterites who dwindled down to 100, and then Lutherans found them and joined them,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of what revived the Hutterites. And and same with Mennonites, two others coming in. So how do we be open to what gifts others bring too?
I'll get your hand, Paul. I saw it there. But I think that in the past we have been insecure about who we are, and when you're insecure about who you are, you erect defensive structures. And defensive structures war against opening your heart to other people. And so if we're okay with who we are, we open up our hearts more to embrace. It is. I'm in danger here of treading on my last night's speech. Some of you might not be here. The other thing that happens is that when you politicize causes, whatever that cause is, political powers always alienate another portion. Powers do. It's you're either one or up, not. And historically, we Anabaptists have said we won't do that, and that has actually given us the space to open up our hearts. people who might not have the opportunities in other places. Now, Paul, you had a question or thought.
Well, I'm just thinking here, whether the last name is Miller or Slayball or Karen Potts, whoever we are, we're living in the middle of the context of what you're describing.
Yeah.
You've had tears, and some people here did too.
So,
Now, if you would give the same story of Anabaptism that we now publish around the world, and we say there are more Anabaptists not in North America,
yeah.
how would you interpret what you just gave here, a powerfully impactful, at least for me, saga? How would that resonate with the Nigerian or the Congolese? Or how would you adapt that? But we say they're the same.
So I think this is from T.S. Eliot, who is my favorite poet. The quartets are amazing. This is from Little Giddings. He said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Sometimes it takes moving out of comfortable and into places where aren't so comfortable to realize the gift we have. So I think that at our core, we're deeply interested in our faith, and we're also very committed to family and community. And so a Nigerian, I've actually given this to non-Mennonite, this deeply resonated with the group I was at in Virginia, where over half the people are first generation Anabaptists. And one of them came up to me afterwards and said, "I felt like I came home when I came to this church." And in some way, maybe we who grew up in it, have to go outside and come back to feel that sometime. But there is something in our journey that invites people to feel at home here. And I think that goes across cultures. I'd be curious for some of you others who don't have the traditional last name. By the way, let me tell you a really freeing thing. There is no merit in being Yoder or Miller. We get no extra grace in heaven. At all. Thank you. We get there the same way you do. Anyone else? Yeah.
Was there ever much interaction between the Mennonite community and the Moravian community?
A little bit. The Moravians are amazing people, by the way. They had a prayer wheel where someone prayed, they broke it up, and someone was praying 24 hours a day, and that prayer wheel went on for 175 years. They were European, they and the Hutterites were Europeans' premier missionaries. There was a little bit. By the 1700s, Amish and Mennonites in America are pretty quiet. And so they're supportive, tentatively supportive, but not engaged with the Moravians. But there is some contact.
There's a large Moravian settlement in Lidditz,
Yeah,
Pennsylvania.
that's right.
They have a school and a college there.
Mm-hmm.
They still make the Moravian stars
Yeah.
and the Moravian sugar cake.
Yeah. And for those of you local, Jeanette Hutton, Goshen. Remember Goshen Dairy Ice Cream? Goshen is named Goshen because the land of Goshen, it was a Moravian Native American settlement just south of New Philadelphia that they named Goshen, land of promise. Unfortunately, it didn't end up to be the land of promise for the Native Americans. And so, kind of back to Paul's thing, I think people the world over are searching for home. Let me tell you another little story. This is my first painting I ever painted. It's a watercolor. I have no clue what made me paint this except I had a picture of my dad's home farm. This is now 2 years after my grandma died, almost 2 years. I painted this on a Tuesday night after graduating Yale on Mondays. And on Wednesday morning, my mother called. Says, I took Dad to the hospital last night. And he was really bad. So I called Dad and said, I think I just have pneumonia. On Friday morning, she called and said, you have to come home if you want to see him alive now. I said, well, Mom, she said, the doctors are saying today. So we we had another week and a half on our lease there. And I don't know what made me do it, but I threw this into my briefcase. And 8.5 hours later, we're at the Altman Hospital. And I realized my father has died. And I took this and I hung it on the post in his room. And he kept looking up at it. He had a tube in his mouth, intubated. He kept pointing to it. He kept reaching out his hands like this. Finally got him a whiteboard and he wrote, I want to go home. I said, Dad, do you want to go back to the farm? He said, no, I want to go home. And a week and a half later, he did. In that we took the breathing tube out so we could communicate with him in that last couple days. And he talked. My dad was the kind of person who to talk publicly would kill him. To have devotions in church nearly took his life. Okay? He was just not a public person like that. He was a truck driver for 30 plus years. And he was always a little claustrophobic, tightness, but he died. He is asphyxiated with fluid in his lungs. He never struggled because he saw home. And he kept telling us, I saw home. And it suddenly struck me that this is our earth. This is something, there's something that happens to me when I go into this driveway that doesn't happen to be anywhere else in the world. But my dad experienced it in the New Kingdom. He kept telling us, oh, the things that I saw. He nearly died twice. And I don't put much stock. I'm pretty rational when it comes to this after, life business that people have. He talks about being in a ruined city and then seeing home. And it suddenly struck me sitting in the hospital room that all of us want to feel that sense of home. And it is the people of the kingdom who should offer that place on earth that reflects what will be in the future. So Berlin should feel like home to the world around us because the people of the kingdom are here. That won't feel like ultimate home that's coming. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so when I think about these journeys of these people, they're always looking into, and there's this pain and sorrow, joy, but also joy and hopefulness. And that's so much of what we experience in life. Hey, it's time to quit. Other questions, quickly. Yeah, Paul.
Okay, if we can join together in a theological sense,
Yeah.
worldwide. There's a book, 2 volumes in the library, called Unsolite.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, are we so treasure unique language, culture, and so forth? In other words, are there other groups of people that also have 2-volume Unsolite that connects 500 years that we resonate this much with just this evening sitting here? Are we that unique?
No, we are unique in a sense.
Do Jewish people,
Yes,
Lutheran
yes.
people, they do the same?
Jews say next year in Jerusalem, They're looking for home. And they have these stories, these continual homeland stories, sagas.
In 500 years, it's just yesterday.
It's yesterday
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
Think about small European village life. Some of the villages we were at in Deichhoff, where Otto Schowalker lives. Their family has lived there for 300 plus years. And so this kind of sense of desire for homeland is built into the human soul. And the stories are there. Now, not all of them are written. By the way, the author of that, Leroy Beach, is in very ill health. And I asked him what he's doing. And he said, I'm staying home waiting to die.
I
95.
got a message that the kids are gonna storm us in 5 seconds.
Yes, just 5 seconds. Come. Let's bring on the storm.
Thank you, Marcus. Really
Yeah, thank
appreciate
you.
it. And you'll be available a little bit after for questions.
Yes, I'll be here for questions.
Thank you.